Hello everyone, and welcome to the North Georgia GMR's Information and Instructional Video segment. I am Atlanta 750 WRMR 367, and my name is Jeff. Today I'm going to go over updating the firmware on an Anytone D578 Pro. I got this new Bluetooth mic, the BT01 from Anytone, which I purchased from Chat Radio. However, the documentation states that the firmware in the radio must be at level 1.18. Since most of the D578 Pros come from the factory with 1.15, we must update the firmware first. There will be another video following this one dedicated to the setup of the Bluetooth microphone. This one will be dedicated to the firmware updates only. And while this video is demonstrating the update on a D578 Pro, the 578 Plus and the D878 models are all very similar, just with different software. So you just got to be paying attention to which firmware levels you are downloading and which firmware levels apply to the radio that you have. So just be mindful of that, and we'll dive in here. So the first thing you're going to notice here with this spreadsheet is the Anytone D578 Pro with GPS and Bluetooth, which is the model of the radio that I have here, requires firmware version 1.18, as well as the SCT version is right here, this 2.01.07, and then the Bluetooth module also has to have this software in it as well. So for all of this to play nice, we then need the BT01, which is the Bluetooth microphone, to be at version 1.01. So what all this boils down to is if we go to the BridgeComm website and go to the product support tab, we're looking for Anytone 578 version 1. Version 1 is for the Pro models. Version 2 is for the Plus models. So again, like I mentioned in the intro, make sure you pay attention to which model of radio you have, and make sure you download the appropriate software. So the version 1 is definitely for the Pro model. So disregard the fact that it says UV3. We're paying attention to the fact that it's a Pro model, and we are looking for version 1.18 as well as version 1.18 of the firmware. So with regard to previous videos that I've made, the firmware and the CPS software that you use to program the radio all must be at the same level. So we're going to have to upgrade the firmware in the radio to version 1.15, version 1.18, and then also switch our CPS software to version 1.18 as well. When we do this, we are going to lose our code plug. When you update the firmware, it's going to clear out the radio, and you are going to have to rebuild your code plug into version 1.18. The software is going to cause problems if you flash the firmware in the radio to version 1.15 and then continue to use the CPS version at 1.15 and then reprogram your radio with your previous code plug. So I have rebuilt my code plug in version 1.18. It's all right here and ready to go. But first we need to go in and do the firmware update in the radio. So if you download that file from BridgeComm, you will get all these folders once you unzip the file. And this chart is in here that I just showed you with the firmware versions and the software versions that everything needs to play along. And then you will see the firmware update file for a D578 UV Pro, which is the radio we have here. So if we go into that, you will find directions and which firmware version to use based on which radio you have. For these Pro models, you will notice there is an AT version of the firmware as well as a GD version of the firmware. Well, how do we know which one to use? If we click on this document here for firmware update, including MC Reboot, you will see this, which is the firmware update instructions. And it will tell you to make sure you do the MC Reboot, but in here, we also need to be mindful of these other steps to follow them in the proper order. So basically, which firmware is which depends on which chip is internal to the radio. Based on a chip shortage after July 1st of 2022, they used one chip, and previous to that, they used a different chip. So some radios will require a GD firmware upgrade, and some radios will require an AT firmware upgrade. And as you can see in the note here, if you select the firmware that's incorrect, it will just report an error, and then you can go back and switch it to the proper version of which one you need based on what chip is internal. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the radio, and then we're going to come back to these instructions and go through it step by step. But the first thing I want to show you is how to check which firmware version your radio has in it currently. So that's important to know because you may not have to do this if your radio is already at version 1.18. So if we switch over here to the face of our radio, and I'm running this radio from the buttons on the microphone just so my fingers aren't in your face. If we go to menu and we scroll down to settings, then we go to device info. You will see a generic radio ID number that I've created, as well as the model, the frequency range, and then we get into version. So most of the 578 Pros come with version 1.15. So this radio does in fact need an update in order for us to proceed with getting this Bluetooth mic working correctly. So if we go back to the laptop here with the directions say to power the radio on and push and hold the menu and exit keys and power the radio off. You may see a non-relevant message on the display while holding the three buttons until the screen is off. After the screen is off, continue holding the menu and exit keys and release the power button and wait for a while until you get a red blinking light. Do not release the menu and the exit keys until the red blinking light is there. So I'm going to slide over here and we'll do that and get it into firmware update mode. And then we will proceed with the process from the laptop. So you have to kind of be a contortionist there to hold those buttons down and push the power button. But as you can see, based on the directions, we now have the red blinking light. So we are in firmware update mode. And you can see by this highlighted in red, highlighted in yellow section rather, that once you enter in firmware update mode, you're in the point of no return. You must complete the firmware update before you can do anything else. So we're going to go ahead and open our computer programming software, which I already have right here, and plug in our programming cable, which is already done. And we are going to go to Tools, and then we are going to go to Firmware Upgrade. may come up based on your security settings in Windows if you would like to allow this publisher to make changes to your device. Yes, we do. Sometimes the firmware update does not come up on the display and you may need to enter it manually. These instructions are also in that document that we were just on, but in this case the window popped up, so that does not apply to us in this case because we have the window right here. So we are going to go ahead and find that file. I'm going to guess, and I could be wrong, and like the document states, if it's wrong, it's just going to pop up with an error message. But this radio was produced in 2001, and I don't know which one is the older chip and which one is the newer chip, but we're going to go ahead and go with the AT version and see what that does for us. So the file has opened successfully. There's our firmware update file. Make sure we're in duplex mode, select the COM port, and we're going to write it to the radio. We'll switch to a multi-view camera here so you can see what's going on. And yes, we want to write it to the radio. And you can see, which I'm glad this happened, because then you know what happens. This radio is a D578 UV base. It uses the GD chip. So I selected the AT software, which is not the right one for this chip in this radio, so we're going to have to go switch back. So we're going to go back to open our update file, back up one folder, select the GD version, open it, open successfully. Now let's try that again. Switch back to the multi-view, and we're going to write it to the radio. You can see while it's processing the information from the laptop that the red light did stop blinking at its normal interval and then went into a different standby state of on solid. All right, so the firmware updated successfully. It says write complete. We can hit OK. We don't need this anymore, which we'll go back to our instructions here. We've done these steps. We wrote the new firmware to the radio. Then after the firmware update is completed, which is where we are right now, you must perform an MCU reboot. Some users will report loss of communication during the firmware update. We did not have that issue, so we're going to go down to the MC reboot steps. To reset the radio, press and hold the two front panel keys, being P2 and the channel knob, which is the one above the microphone connector. The channel knob also rotates and is a button, so we have to push that as a button as well as P2 while we turn on the radio, which will reboot the radio into reset mode. And we are going to go ahead and do that now. So we're going to push P2 and the channel knob and boot the radio up. So now you will see a question come up on the radio, are you sure you want to initialize the radio, which is part of the MCU reboot process. So yes, we have to complete the process. So we are going to hit confirm, or in this case, the button doesn't match what the screen says. So we're just going to hit the menu button, which will confirm that we do want to initialize the radio. So after we complete the MCU reboot, it's going to again ask us for the calibration dates and time zones and all those kinds of things that it asked us when we first bought the radio and opened the package, and basically a new radio setup because we've just rebooted the firmware and done an MCU reboot. So as far as the radio is concerned, it thinks it's new. So anything that was in that radio existing is now gone. So I'm going to go ahead and set these settings, and then we'll move on to the next step. So now that I set the date and the time zone, it should boot up from what you're used to with the old firmware version. And we are just going to have a blank radio with no code plug in it. So if we go back here to our settings menu, the first thing we're going to do is shut off that annoying beep so that we don't have to hear it every time. So now if we go back to device info, we should see the radio ID, which is going to be the generic default one. The frequency range is still the same. And now we are at firmware version 1.18. And if we go back here to the spreadsheet so that we can see that at the same time, the firmware version 1.18 came out in April of 2023. Our SCT software is at 2.01.07. And our Bluetooth software is that big long number of letters and numbers combined. AQQX. So the firmware software inside the radio has taken to the radio. So now we can go over here to our 1.18 version CPS software. Again, I already have the code plug loaded. Now we can set our COM port. Okay. And we can write it to the radio. Again, the radio has no memory of anything we had in it previous, so if you have digital contacts and other things, you're going to want to select both of those boxes and then write everything to the radio. You can see the laptop sends the information much faster than the radio receives it, but when it's done it will reboot, and we should see some information from that code plug with repeaters and simplex channels for GMRS. So we have successfully updated the firmware in this radio. There are other things in this file here with regard to Bluetooth module updates and those kinds of things, but I don't know as though we have to do that to get the microphone to work. But we have successfully completed our firmware update, so that is the end of this particular video. And if the Bluetooth modules need to be updated, we will include that with the video for the Bluetooth microphone itself. Thanks again to Chat Radio, and thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We are North Georgia GMRS, and I am Atlanta 750 WRMR 367, and my name is Jeff. I hope this video helps get you on the air and get your firmware updated, and I hope to hear you on the air real soon. Thanks for watching.